How's it? Hang loose. We're going to look a little bit into the history books, in this case, a collection of slides. I put this together for a classroom a while back. This is just basic. So, if we look at the United States of America becoming a world power, we're going to have to start back about 1872 to 1912. So this would be before World War I, and basically sort of right after the American Civil War by about a decade or so. So let's start with Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. Here's a depiction. Notice how glorified his persona is in this photograph. Charging up the hill, the charge of the Light Brigade kind of motif. Well, he was known at the time in the public eye as a great hero from the West. And he was actually from New York. Let's get into this. So, the imperialistic vision. The empire, imperialism. Now, we all know that the rise and fall, not the rise and fall so much, but the British Empire with its colonies. What about this vision for the United States? And remember that it was the states before the U.S. Civil War, and after the U.S. Civil War, it's the country referred to as the United States of America. So the desire for new markets. By the late 1800s, the growth of investment opportunities in Western Europe had slowed. So this is economic reasons. Most of the factories, railroads, mines that Europe's economy needed had been built. In a protectorate, that would be a key word, because if you have the British Empire had colonies, here's an idea of the protectorate instead of colony. It's the imperial power over it is allowed the local rulers to stay in control and protected them against rebellions and invasions, very much like the ancient Rome model. In exchange for this protection, the local rulers usually had to accept advice from the Europeans on how to govern their countries. The feeling of superiority. Many supporters of social Darwinism argued that nations competed with each other politically, economically, and militarily, and that only the strongest would survive. As a side note, this really doesn't have to do with Charles Darwin's natural selection theory. It is a social Darwinism. So they took the explorer, naturalist, poor old Charles Darwin, and they took his theories on evolution via natural selection, and they applied it to the social human world, basically boiling it incorrectly down to the strongest would survive, which sort of goes into the strong deserve to win, which is a ground foundation of fascism. Only the strongest. Now used this idea to justify expanding the power of the U.S. overseas. Anglo-Saxonism. Now, this describes the destiny and duty of the U.S. This is an idea, the destiny and duty of the U.S. to expand overseas and to shape less civilized areas. So the thinking at the time was biased, where kind of a xenophobic, that's Xeno, xenophobic, afraid of the outside world is what that means. And so therefore that develops that we're superior and those people out there are pretty much savages. And they try to be polite and say they're less civilized. And they had the idea that it's their duty and their destiny to envelop the less civilized world. And it probably has some biblical justifications, not correctly so, but cherry-picked selections out of the Bible to support such ideas. Another influential advocate was Joshua Strong, who was a popular minister in the late 1800s. And this is where you have a lot of the Great Awakening type of movements of Protestantism. He linked Anglo-Saxonism to Christianity missionary ideas. I second-guessed myself there. He linked Anglo-Saxonism to Christian missionary ideas. So you gotta go civilize the pagans and basically those savages in more brutal words, but that's where they were coming from. Now, expansion in the Pacific in 1852, after receiving several petitions from Congress, President Franklin Pierce decided to force Japan to trade with the U.S. So this is economics via military backing. He ordered Commodore Matthew Perry, a significant figure in what's happening here, to take naval expedition to Japan to negotiate a trade treaty. So Matthew Perry goes to Japan, goes into the ports and harbors over there, and in the 1850s, Japan was definitely a different social, economic, cultural place than it is today. You have that feudal Japan thing. I believe, there's samurai at that point, and basically here comes a superior naval person and Matthew Perry, and they're just, we're going to trade with you, okay. And here's a portrait of, a photograph portrait of Commodore Matthew Perry. 4 American warships under Perry's command entered Yedo Bay. The Japanese had never seen steamships before and were impressed by the display of American technology and firepower. So, what was once more a very cultural Japan, where its traditions were so much pure in their culture, and then you start seeing depictions of what the sailing ships were coming in and what they may have encountered. Now, the Hawaii conflict. I believe there's some vignettes or old snippets of stories embedded in this slideshow. Here's a pretty old map of Hawaii, as in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. These 8 islands consist of the current state of Hawaii, but at that time it wasn't even a territory, or let's say this was under a monarch rule. And the shipping in and out with sailing vessels has long been established since Captain Cook, James Cook, discovered these islands in the view of England's first encounter with these islands. They weren't discovered initially by him. And even, I believe, earlier than Cook, there was on Maui in the Port Lahaina, there was whaling vessels, and also on Kauai, even from Russia, there was whaling ships coming in and out. At this time, there was a queen, and she was deposed, and locally here, there's a lot of controversy over the exact nature and details of that, because history gets rewritten. And however, there was initially petition against the annexation, because the annexation would lead directly to statehood, but there was actually a great celebration when it did become a state. And the overthrow is a long story. So let's just getting into the annexation part. There was a provincial government before this. So in 1891, Queen Liliuokalani was the last monarch of Hawaii. She inherited the throne from her brother, King David Kalakaua, who was returning from a sailing voyage across the world, in a sense, and he died. So when the ships returned, he was already dead. They were flying a black flag, and Liliuokalani, saddened, of course, at the death of her brother, but also realizing that she was now queen. And she did not like the influence that American settlers had gained in Hawaii. And there's a lot to this. I won't get too far into it, but early missionaries started to marry into the royal bloodline. And then there was a business group of landowners doing plantation stuff, and that had a big influence that she probably didn't like, as in this American settlers being very vague. And I believe this is a picture of statehood day, and there was a lot of support in this transition from annexation to statehood. And this has got to be another statehood picture. So that would be 1959. Trade and diplomacy in Latin America. So this would be basically, could say South America, but in the Latin part, of course, because the Spanish influence from early explorers, the Spanish and the Portuguese, but mostly the Spanish, were concerned with here, as Spanish derives from Latin, as does Italian and French. They are Latin based. So Latin America, James G. Blaine served as Secretary of State for the U.S. in 2 administrations in the 1880s. He invited Latin American nations to attend the first International American Conference in Washington, D.C. in 1889. International American. The idea that the U.S. and Latin America should work together became called Pan-Americanism. Blaine wanted to create customs union between Latin America and the U.S. and wanted to create a system for the American nations to work out their disputes peacefully. So you see, they basically didn't want conflict, and the reason they didn't want conflict is because they wanted to boost this economic tie, basically between the U.S. and Latin American countries. The customs union would require all of the American nations to reduce their tariffs against each other. So a tariff is just like a basic tax, the import-export. So good comes in, and if they put high tariffs on it, it makes it less cost-effective. But if they start reducing the tariffs, then there's a lot of goods going back and forth being bought and sold with the imports and exports. Blaine hoped that the customs union would turn the Latin Americans away from European products and towards American products. Basically, with lower tariffs, the trade with the American products would increase. They rejected both of Blaine's ideas. That would be Congress. Building the modern Navy. Captain Alfred T. Mahan, an officer of the U.S. Navy, wrote a best-selling book that helps build public support for a big Navy. Let's jump right to the Spanish-American War. The coming of war. No one is sure why the Maine exploded. This is a small ship that could go to seaports and up rivers. The Maine. It came into a harbor and it blew up. The explosion happened. Many Americans blamed it on Spain. So, one of those events, a very tragic event, and in a matter of weeks, Spain and the U.S. were at war, simply because of they blamed it on Spain. What really happened to the Maine is probably an interesting deep dive into a historical moment. The Maine entering Havana, so this is in Cuba, by the way, so it's just south of that Gulf of Mexico, Florida. So the USS Maine enters Havana Harbor and it blows up. Here's some photos, the aftermath. That's what that would be looking like. And of course the large funeral after. Clara Barton is a founder of the Red Cross. I believe there's a...
Clara Barton, the founder and first president of the American National Red Cross, was working late in her villa overlooking the harbor in Havana, Cuba, on the evening of February 15th, 1898. As she and an assistant reviewed some paperwork, an enormous blast lit up the sky. She later recalled, "The deafening roar was such a burst of thunder as perhaps one never heard before. And off to the right, out over the bay, the air filled with a blaze of light, and this in turn filled with black specks like huge specters flying in all directions." Barton quickly learned what had happened. The USS Maine, anchored in the Havana harbor, had exploded. Barton rushed to a nearby hospital, where she took a first-hand look at the blast's devastation. The sailors' wounds, she wrote, were all over them, heads and faces terribly cut, internal wounds, arms, legs, feet, and hands burned to the live flesh.
So basically she was eyewitness to that, and I'm not precisely sure if she started the American Red Cross after that or she'd already had that started, but she was in that ministry of healing and nursing. The Cuban Rebellion begins. In 1868, Cuban rebels declared independence and launched a guerrilla war against the Spanish authorities, which they failed. Basically, which failed. Pardon my grammar there. So, Spain was the overseer of Cuba. it was theirs in the sense of imperialism and colonialism, but it's more like a protectorate situation. However, the Cuban rebels wanted to be independent. They didn't want it was their land, and they didn't want the occupiers, so they had a guerrilla war, and that failed. Americans watching this happen supported the Cubans and compared their struggle to their own experience in the American Revolution some 100 years earlier, calling out for war. In 1898, the New York Journal printed a private letter written by Enrique Dupré de Lome, the Spanish ambassador to the U.S. Basically, they got a private letter and they put it in the paper. A Cuban agent intercepted the letter and delivered it to the paper. So basically, you see where the motives go. I always look for the motives. So he's a Spanish ambassador and he's one of these rebels, and he got that letter and has had it in the press. Here's the letter, described President McKinley as weak and a bitter for the admiration of the crowd. Huh. The nation erupted in a fury over the insult. Public opinion within the Republican Party, jingoism is an attitude of aggressive nationalism, and it was very, very strong. Aggressive nationalism, jingoism. However, these members were furious when McKinley did not declare war. So now there's a war on two fronts. The U.S. had more battleships, and both sides knew that the war ultimately would be decided at sea. If the U.S. could defeat Spain's fleet, the Spanish would not be able to get supplies into its troops in Cuba. Here's a photo of what some of these ships are looking like and the sailors aboard. The U.S. takes the Philippines. The U.S. Navy was ready for war with Spain under Commodore George Dewey. While waiting for more American troops to arrive, Dewey contracted Emilio Aguinaldo, a Filipino revolutionary leader who staged an unsuccessful uprising against the Spanish in 1896. So they went and contacted an expert, you might say, even though he failed. He knew something about the Spanish. A volunteer cavalry unit from the American West, known as the Rough Riders, helped the American troops fight in Cuba. Their commander was Colonel Leonard Wood. Their second in command was Theodore Roosevelt. So here you have Theodore Roosevelt here. This is Colonel Leonard Wood. Apparently here is a retired Confederate General Wheeler. So, as you know, the Civil War wasn't that long in the past. It was just basically about a decade before. So they're tapping in on all their military strategists if they could. Here's a depiction of the voluntary cavalry unit. So basically horsemen from the West, the Rough Riders. And they assisted other U.S. forces, and Theodore Roosevelt was the second in command, so he was prominent in that force. So here's what Cuba looked like in the map of where the American ships, which Shafter would come down here. Miles went off in this direction, and these are U.S. ships forming a blockade. And the Spanish from Spain, they went up here, Cervera, to fight in Santiago de Cuba. And here you have the San Juan Hill, which is the scene of the Rough Riders' participation. So that was the major battle there. And this, of course, started this, started the complete sentiment, even though that would have been just a trigger, and sentiments existed before, and it's always the case. Debate over annexation. Many supporters of annexing the Philippines emphasized the economic and military benefits of taking the islands, one of them being sugarcane. One, it would provide the U.S. with a naval base in Asia. The Pacific, but also very close to the Asian continent. And it would provide a large market for American goods, which is really the underlying main motivation here. They believed America had a duty to teach less civilized people how to live properly. And this would be lesser of a motive than this, increasing their market. There's groups of people that really did have the attitude of less civilized people, and they would use that as public persuasion. On December 10th, 1898, the U.S. and Spain signed the Treaty of Paris. Under this treaty, Cuba became an independent country, and the U.S. acquired Puerto Rico, Guam, and bought the Philippines from Spain. So basically, America's winning the Spanish-American War. And for an X amount of money, they bought Spain's claim of the Philippines, bringing the Philippines underneath the U.S. now. And Cuba as an independent country. But the U.S. also acquired Puerto Rico and Guam, Guam being in the Pacific. The U.S. had become an imperial power. This is the crossing that definition border of actually the USA becoming imperial. Rebellion in the Philippines. After much fighting, the U.S. granted independence to the Philippines in 1946. Notice this is after World War II, and after much fighting, there's a lot of history in that. Governing in Puerto Rico. In 1900, Congress passed the Foraker Act, making Puerto Rico an unincorporated territory. This being that the Puerto Ricans were not U.S. citizens. They weren't incorporated into the Union. So they're not U.S. citizens and had no constitutional rights. And that Puerto Rico, that accounts for a lot of their woes in the current times. Cuba and the Platt Amendment. President McKinley took steps to ensure that Cuba would remain tied to the U.S. by way of the Platt Amendment. New American diplomacy. Theodore Roosevelt's rise to power. So, due to Roosevelt's exploits during the Spanish-American War, Rough Riders, he became famous, and that enabled him to win the governor election of New York in 1898. In 1900, President McKinley asked him to run as his vice president. And here is more depictions. This is Theodore Roosevelt and some visuals. So, and of course, a vignette.
Theodore Roosevelt, Senator, embodied the spirit of the United States at the turn of the century, full of vitality, brimming with confidence, and convinced that no job was impossible, no challenge insurmountable. Whether hunting big game in Africa, roping cattle from horseback on a Dakota ranch, or leading his Rough Riders cavalry up San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt never did anything cautiously or quietly. As president, Roosevelt guided the country into its new, unaccustomed role as a world power.
All right, not only that he was a hero, seen as hero in this Rough Rider Western context and the cavalry with horses, there's a lot more to him as he goes up to vice president and then president. So the election of 1900, on September 6, 1901, President McKinley was assassinated by an avowed anarchist. This is no government anarchy, so at least that's what the assassin says. So President McKinley is dead. Theodore Roosevelt, 42 years at the time, became the youngest person ever to become president. I think that is no longer present, but at that time, Roosevelt had been chosen as McKinley's running mate because Republican leaders knew his powerful charisma and heroic war record would be a great asset. So Roosevelt becomes president. Born into a wealthy New York family, Roosevelt was a sickly child who endured a host of ailments, including poor eyesight and asthma. So you could say, as a child, he was a wimpy kid. And notice the complete change around in his persona as an adult. American diplomacy in Asia. In 1899, the U.S. was a major power in Asia with naval bases all across the Pacific. Open door policy. In 1894, war erupted between China and Japan over Korea. Japan easily defeated China in the peace treaty. China granted Korea independence and gave Japan territory in Manchuria. Sphere of influence, an important concept. This is describing an area where a foreign nation controlled economic development such as railroad, construction, and mining. So natural resources and the means for transportation, and a foreign nation is controlling that in an area, so that would be in their sphere of influence. Secretary of State John Hay supported the open door policy, in which all countries should be allowed to trade with China. Remember, China was defeated by Japan. He negotiated with the European powers and Japan. But that's not what the local folk really wanted to be going on in their land. Secret Chinese societies, sometimes called boxers, and if you recall from interviews of Bruce Lee, famed for his kung fu movies, and he would Bruce Lee from China would call kung fu Chinese boxing. So basically, these boxers are literally boxers, a little bit like martial art. And they organized to get rid of foreign control. So they had the Boxer Rebellion in 1899. And here's a depiction of a Russian soldier carried by rickshaw. So their influence from occupying of sphere of influences from different areas, balance of power in East Asia. At a peace conference in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Roosevelt convinced the Russians to recognize Japan's territorial gains and persuaded the Japanese to stop fighting and to seek no further territory. So this is all in that area concerning that Boxer Rebellion thing. Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 due to his efforts in ending that war. A growing presence in the Caribbean. Theodore Roosevelt believed in a strong global military presence. He often expressed this belief with a West African saying, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Of course, this modern use of Theodore Roosevelt's idea of the big stick diplomacy has been portrayed in other one. This one, speak loudly and poke 'em with a big stick policy in a political cartoon. I guess these are Americans looking shocked at this politician who I'm not sure who this is, but he's poking, I think, Putin when he was in the UN. We're a superpower and you're not, poking them. And these fellows here have black eyes. I'm not sure what this reads. He's just going around, we're a superpower. So this big stick diplomacy twisted with speak loudly and poke them with a big stick policy. That's the cartoon idea. So in the U.S. possessions in the Pacific, if you notice, okay, there's the Pacific Ocean, Hawaii smack dab in the middle, pretty much. And here would be the equator. So these are possessions that are depicted in orange. You have American Samoa, Palmer Atolls, Hawaiian Islands, Johnson, Wake, Midway, Guam, and way over here, the Philippines, close to the Asian continent. So, and of course, Alaska. And all these are U.S. possessions by 1899. Now back to the Panama Canal in Latin America. In 1901, the U.S. and Great Britain signed the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, which gave the U.S. the exclusive right to build and control any proposed canal through Central America. So there's a treaty that lays down the groundwork. In 1903, Panama was still part of Colombia. So they had to try to negotiate with Colombia to build a canal. This is what the Panama Canal after it was made looks a little bit like. It's Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and it has to rise up. So these are very large transport ships. And they go to one lock, and it fills up, and they go to the next, like a step up steps. And they fill and drain these to match the levels so the ship can eventually go across. A very difficult engineering thing in that regard. An interesting innovation, but the actual digging and constructing of it was quite a marvel, especially for the time. But there was more to it.
Upon arriving in Panama in 1904, Dr. William Crawford Gorgas, a U.S. Army doctor and chief sanitary officer to the Panama Canal project, quickly realized that death awaited American workers. The United States was about to begin constructing the Panama Canal to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The task would be daunting because the dense jungles of Panama were home to swarms of mosquitoes that spread the deadly disease of yellow fever. Gorgas set out to lessen the threat of disease by keeping mosquitoes from breeding. He and his crew drained swamps, gullies, and other sources of stagnant water, a main breeding ground for mosquitoes. On those areas of water they could not drain, they spread kerosene and oil, which killed the mosquito eggs before they hatched. They also fumigated nearly every home in the region and destroyed many buckets, pots, and other outdoor containers that local residents let fill up with rainwater. In 2 years, Gorgas and his crew had wiped out yellow fever in the area.
That's a vignette upon one of their great problems in digging the canal, yellow fever spread by mosquitoes. And the mosquito problem was also in Orlando, Florida, with Disney World, and you can look up how Disney World combated the mosquito problem. Kind of interesting. Revolt in Panama. French company's agent Philippe Bunau Valrilla and Panamanian officials decided that the only way to ensure the canal would be built was declare independence and make their own deal with the U.S. So Panama basically had a revolt, became their own country by declaring independence, and they're declaring independence from Colombia. So steam-powered cannon-equipped battleship, the U.S. Commodore Perry, named after the Commodore Perry of opening up Japan for trade. So you have what it looks, you see the iron side type of thing and cannons. That is a battleship. Roosevelt Corollary. Roosevelt addressed to Congress in 1904 that the U.S. would intervene in Latin American affairs when necessary to maintain economic and political stability in the Western Hemisphere. So they really wanted North and South America. That side would be the Western Hemisphere. This became known as the Roosevelt Corollary. And then political cartoon of the very vibrant Theodore Roosevelt in his presidential days. Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, continued his policies. Believed, Taft did, that if American business leaders supported Latin America and Asian development, everyone would benefit. This is economic. His policy came to be known as dollar diplomacy. And that is that. Thank you for hanging out and listening with a little bit of basic history, showing how the U.S. became a imperial power. Hang loose. Aloha.